Somewhere along the Aegean coast, in the fading warmth of an October afternoon roughly 2,500 years ago, a trireme came home for the last time that year. The oarsmen knew it was coming. They could feel it in the chop of the water, in the colour of the sky, in the way the wind had shifted from the steady summer south to something harder and less predictable from the north. The season was ending. The sea, which had been their road for 7 months, was preparing to close. The trireme was called something we will never know. The Greeks named their warships. They gave them personalities. They painted eyes on the prows so the ships could see where they were going. This particular ship had spent the summer patrolling, trading, perhaps fighting, riding the predictable winds that made the ancient Mediterranean navigable for those who understood its rhythms. But now those rhythms were changing, and the men who lived by them knew what came next. What came next was the haul out. The process of bringing the ship out of the water entirely, dragging it up onto land and leaving it there until spring. This was not a matter of preference. It was not a sign of weakness or timidity. It was one of the most essential and carefully organised acts in the entire calendar of ancient maritime life, and the civilizations that did it well, the Greeks, the Phoenicians, the Romans, the Vikings, the medieval Venetians, tended to dominate the seas in their respective ages. The civilizations that neglected it, or that failed to build the infrastructure to support it, found their fleets rotting at anchor before a single enemy ship ever came close. The question of why ancient ships were hauled ashore every winter is, on the surface, a question about wood and water. It is about the physical properties of timber, about the creatures that live in the sea, about the storms that make certain passages suicidal between October and March. But the deeper you go into this question, the more you realise it is also a question about human civilization itself, about how ancient peoples organised their economies, their religions, their social structures, and their understanding of time around the seasonal nature of the sea. The haul-out was not just a maintenance procedure, it was a ritual, an economic event, a community gathering, and in some places a religious ceremony. The ship coming out of the water was as meaningful as the ship going in. To understand why, we need to start with something most of us take completely for granted: the nature of wood, the material that ancient ships were made from, the material that, for thousands of years, was the only substance available to build something large enough to carry cargo, soldiers, and empire across open water. Wood is extraordinary. It is strong, it is flexible, it can be shaped and joined and repaired. But it has one property that makes it deeply unsuited to permanent immersion in seawater, and that property is the reason the entire system of seasonal hauling existed. But before we get to the wood, and the worms, and the elaborate rituals of the boatyard, let us stay on that October beach for a moment longer. Let us watch the trireme come in. The helmsman, the Kybernetes, has been watching the coastline for an hour, reading the landmarks that tell him exactly where the shipyard is. Ancient Greek harbours were not vague places. They were precisely engineered environments, and the men who ran them knew every inch of the shoreline. As the trireme enters shallow water, the rhythm of the oars changes. The stroke that had been powering the ship through open water becomes something shorter and more controlled, angled to slow rather than drive. The bow nudges toward a stone-paved ramp that slopes down into the water at a gentle angle. The ramp has been there for decades, maybe longer, worn smooth by hundreds of ships before this one. At the top of the ramp stands a structure that would have been familiar to any sailor in the ancient Mediterranean world. A long, low building open at one end, its roof supported by rows of stone or wooden columns, sized exactly to shelter a trireme from the weather. This is the Neosoikos, the ship shed, and it is one of the most important buildings in the Greek world. But getting the ship into that shed is not a simple matter. A trireme fully loaded with equipment weighs somewhere between 40 and 60 tons. It sits in the water with apparent ease. That is what ships are designed to do. But the moment you try to bring it onto land, all of that weight becomes a problem. The ancient world solved this problem with a combination of technology so elegant and so effective that it remained essentially unchanged for over 2,000 years. Wooden rollers, grease, ropes, and human muscle. The rollers were laid out on the ramp in advance, smooth logs of hardwood, oak or elm, greased with olive oil or animal fat. The ship was brought in bow first until the keel touched the first roller. Then ropes were attached, run back up the ramp to a capstan or a team of oxen, or simply to the combined strength of every man available, and the haul began. The ship groaned. The timbers shifted and creaked under the unfamiliar pressure of dry land pressing up against them where water had been moments before. The oarsmen scrambled out to lighten the load, and slowly, metre by metre, the trireme moved up the ramp. To a modern observer watching this process, the most striking thing might be how organised it was. This was not improvised. There were men whose specific job was to manage the rollers, running each one from the back of the ship to the front as the hull moved over them, keeping the load distributed evenly. There were men watching the keel for signs of stress. There were men managing the ropes, adjusting the tension. The whole operation had a choreography that spoke of centuries of refinement, of thousands of ships hauled in exactly this way, of knowledge passed down from father to son, and from master shipwright to apprentice across generations so long that no one could remember when the practice had begun. When the ship finally reached the top of the ramp and rested inside the shed on wooden cradles that cradled the hull on both sides, the men allowed themselves to rest. The vessel that would carry them to war or trade or adventure in the spring was now safe for the winter, and the work, the real work, of keeping it alive could begin. To understand the urgency of the haul-out, you need to understand what wood is doing when it is submerged in seawater for long periods of time, and the answer is both simple and profound. It is dying. Not quickly, not dramatically, but steadily and irreversibly if it is not cared for. The sea does not rust ships the way it rusts iron. It does something slower and in some ways more insidious. It saturates them, swells them, weakens them, and eventually opens them up to a biological assault so relentless and so voracious that it can reduce a sound timber hull to something resembling Swiss cheese in a single season. Let us begin with water absorption. Wood is a porous material. Under normal circumstances, this is part of what makes it useful. It breathes, it flexes slightly, it absorbs and releases moisture in ways that help it resist cracking in changing conditions. But when you submerge a piece of wood in water, something different happens. The cells that make up the wood begin to absorb water far faster than they can release it. Over weeks and months of immersion, the wood becomes waterlogged. It swells, it becomes heavier, and the fibres that give it strength begin to break down. The wood that entered the water as a structural element is slowly becoming something softer and less reliable. For a ship built from planks joined together with wooden pegs, the standard ancient construction method, this swelling had a double effect. On one hand, it caused the planks to swell into their joints, which temporarily improved the watertight seal. This is why ancient ships leaked considerably when they were first launched, and why experienced sailors knew to give a new ship time to take up, to absorb enough water that the seams closed. On the other hand, extended immersion eventually caused the planks to swell beyond the capacity of their joints, creating internal stresses that could split timber, crack pegs, and eventually force gaps in the hull through which water would pour with lethal indifference. Ancient shipwrights understood this instinctively, without the modern vocabulary to describe it. They knew that a ship left in the water too long became waterlogged and slow. They knew that the planks moved in ways that could not be predicted and not always corrected. They knew that a ship hauled out and allowed to dry thoroughly in the winter shed was lighter, tighter, and faster in the spring than a ship that had spent the same winter riding at anchor. The empirical knowledge was exact, even if the theoretical explanation was beyond their reach. But water absorption was only the beginning of the problem. The real catastrophe, the one that kept ancient shipwrights awake at night, was what lived in the water. Specifically, what was eating the ships from the outside in. The creature responsible for more maritime destruction than all the storms and wars in ancient history combined is called Teredo navalis, the shipworm. It is not actually a worm. It is a bivalve mollusk, a relative of the clam and the oyster, but one that has evolved a remarkable and devastating strategy. It uses a pair of tiny shells at its head as drill bits, boring into submerged wood and spending its entire life inside the tunnel it creates, filtering nutrients from the water it draws through the wood. The shipworm is small. A juvenile teredo is barely visible to the naked eye when it first encounters a ship's hull. It bores a tiny hole through the outer surface of the wood and vanishes inside, and from that moment on it is essentially invisible. The hole closes behind the worm with a calcareous lining that the creature secretes, sealing itself in and sealing the visible evidence out. The outside of the plank looks perfectly sound, but inside the worm is growing, boring, branching, sometimes reaching a length of 30 centimetres or more, and meanwhile others of its species are doing exactly the same thing in planks all around it. A ship that has spent a summer in warm Mediterranean waters can have hundreds of thousands of individual shipworms inside its hull, a living labyrinth of tunnels that has converted what was once dense structural timber into something with the integrity of a honeycomb. The ancient sources are full of references to the terror the shipworm inspired. Greek and Roman writers describe ships that looked sound from the outside but collapsed when pressure was applied, hulls that, when examined after hauling, revealed interiors so riddled with worm channels that a man could push his finger straight through the plank. Theophrastus, the Greek botanist who studied timber properties in the 4th century BC, noted specific types of wood that were more resistant to worm damage than others, and his observations fed directly into shipbuilding practices that tried to use those woods for the parts of the hull most vulnerable to attack. The shipworm's Achilles heel was exactly what the ancient world exploited. It could not survive being out of water. Teredo navalis requires continuous immersion. Once the wood is removed from the sea and allowed to dry, the worm dies within days. Any eggs or juveniles on the surface of the hull die before they can bore in. A ship that is hauled out every winter and kept dry in a shed for 5 or 6 months is effectively purged of shipworm every year. The infestation that has accumulated over the sailing season is killed, the tunnels dry out and stabilise, and the hull goes back into the water the following spring in a condition that is, if not perfect, at least manageable. A ship that is never hauled out never gets this reprieve. Alongside the shipworm, ancient hulls faced a second biological threat, the barnacle. Barnacles are crustaceans that cement themselves to any hard surface in seawater. Rocks, pier pilings, and ships' hulls with equal enthusiasm. An individual barnacle is harmless. A hull encrusted with barnacles from waterline to keel, which is what happens after a single season at sea, is a different matter entirely. The barnacles add weight. They change the hydrodynamic profile of the hull, creating drag that slows the ship significantly. A trireme encrusted with a season's worth of barnacle growth could be measurably slower than a clean hull, and in ancient naval warfare, where battles were decided by the ability to ram an enemy ship and then back out before, being rammed in return, every fraction of a knot in speed could determine who went home and who went to the bottom. The haul-out solved the barnacle problem as efficiently as it solved the shipworm problem. Barnacles, like shipworms, die when removed from water. Once the ship was on the ramp, the barnacles could be scraped off with iron tools, taking whatever damage they had done to the outer surface with them, and the hull could be cleaned back to bare wood before the protective coatings were applied. The scraping was vigorous work, and the sound of iron tools on barnacle-crusted wood must have been one of the defining sounds of every ancient harbour in the autumn months. A rasping, grinding noise that meant the fleet was coming home and the long work of keeping it alive had begun. And then there was the fungus, less dramatic than the shipworm, less famous than the barnacle, but equally deadly in the long term. The various species of marine and freshwater fungi that attack submerged woodwork in a different way. Rather than boring through the wood mechanically, they digest it chemically, breaking down the cellulose and lignin that give timber its strength. A plank attacked by wood-rotting fungi becomes soft and spongy, losing its structural integrity from the inside in a way that's even harder to detect than shipworm damage. Pull out a peg from a fungus-infected plank, and the whole crumbles rather than holding clean. Tap the hull with a mallet and the sound is wrong, flat dead, lacking the resonance of healthy timber. Ancient shipwrights developed an almost musical sensitivity to the sounds of their ships' hulls, and part of the winter inspection ritual was exactly this kind of percussive examination, walking the length of the hauled ship, tapping steadily, listening for the places where the sound changed. Where it did, the plank had to come out, and what they found inside those planks told the story of everything the water had been doing while the ship was sailing. The ancient shipyard was one of the most carefully planned and heavily invested pieces of infrastructure in the pre-modern world. We tend to think of ancient harbours as relatively simple places, a beach, some docks, perhaps a few warehouses. But the great maritime powers of the ancient world understood that maintaining a fleet of warships or merchant vessels required something far more sophisticated. A permanent, purpose-built facility with specialised ramps, covered sheds, workshops, storage areas, and a skilled workforce that remained on site year-round. The difference between a civilization that had this infrastructure and one that did not was often the difference between a maritime power and a coastal civilization that happened to have boats. The greatest example of ancient naval infrastructure in the classical world was the Piraeus, the harbour complex of Athens. The Piraeus was not simply a port. It was a technological system of extraordinary complexity built over decades during Athens' rise to naval supremacy in the 5th century BC, maintained and expanded through the height of Athenian power, and sufficiently impressive that even after Athens' decline it continued to function as one of the Mediterranean's great harbours for centuries afterward. Excavations of the Piraeus have revealed the foundations of the Neosoikoi, the ship sheds, in numbers that speak to the scale of Athenian naval ambition. At its height, the Piraeus had accommodation for somewhere between 350 and 400 triremes, each in its own dedicated shed. Each Neosoikos was built to a precise template. The interior was just wide enough for a trireme to fit with a small working margin on each side, roughly 6 metres, corresponding to the beam of the standard Athenian trireme. The length was about 40 metres, matching the trireme's hull. The floor of the shed sloped slightly toward the open end, which faced the water, creating a natural drainage, gradient that helped keep the interior dry. The roof was supported by stone columns spaced to allow workers to move freely around the ship while it rested inside, and the entire structure was designed so that light and air could circulate, critical factors in keeping the dried timber from developing its own sets of problems related to trapped moisture. The ramps leading from the sheds into the water were engineering works in their own right. They had to be solid enough to support the rolling weight of a loaded ship being dragged across them, smooth enough to allow the rollers to turn freely, and precisely angled so that the ship could be moved with the available manpower. Too steep, and the ship would be uncontrollable on the way down. Too shallow, and the forward portion of the keel would not reach the water before the stern was still on dry land, creating uneven hull loading that could crack the keel. The Athenians got this angle right. Their ramps were engineering masterpieces, born of long experience, and the dimensions they established became the template for naval infrastructure across the Greek world. Away from Athens, the same principles were applied by every major naval power. At Carthage, the great Phoenician colony on the North African coast that would eventually become Rome's most dangerous rival, the harbours were divided into 2 distinct areas, a commercial harbour for merchant shipping and a separate enclosed military harbour for the war fleet. The military harbour, described in detail by the Greek historian Appian, had enough berths for 220 warships, each protected by its own shed. The harbour was so arranged that the fleet could be mobilised rapidly. Ships could be launched and crewed and at sea within hours of the order being given. But the infrastructure for winter maintenance was equally sophisticated. The island of Rhodes, which at its height in the 3rd and 2nd centuries BC was arguably the greatest maritime power in the eastern Mediterranean, had a naval infrastructure that ancient sources describe in reverential terms. The Rhodians were the acknowledged masters of seamanship in the Hellenistic world, and their mastery rested not just on the skill of their sailors, but on the quality of their ships and the rigour of their maintenance culture. Rhodian naval regulations, fragments of which survive in inscriptions, specified in detail the conditions under which ships could be hauled out, the standards of inspection required, the materials to be used in repairs, and the penalties for officials who failed to maintain the fleet to the required standard. These regulations tell us something important about how seriously the ancient world took ship maintenance. This was not an informal ad hoc process. It was a system of institutional accountability that reached from the individual sailor up through the triarch, the wealthy citizen who commanded and equipped a trireme, to the naval boards that oversaw the fleet as a whole. At Athens, the board of officials responsible for the fleet was called the Epistatai ton Neosoikon, the overseers of the ship sheds, and their responsibilities included ensuring that every ship assigned to a shed was properly housed, properly maintained, and properly equipped when the sailing season ended. The accounts they kept, recording the condition of every ship and every piece of equipment assigned to it, survive in fragmentary form in inscriptions and give us a uniquely detailed picture of ancient naval administration. One of the most revealing of these inscriptions is a set of ship inventories from the late 4th century BC, recovered from the Piraeus, and recording the state of the Athenian fleet over several successive years. Reading these inventories is like reading the pulse of a civilization. Ships are listed with their names, their assigned sheds, the condition of their hulls, oars, rigging, and equipment. Notes record when repairs were made, by whom, Using what materials? Damaged ships are flagged for special attention. Ships that are too old or too damaged to be cost-effectively maintained are marked for disposal, sold off, or broken up for timber. The whole document breathes with the consciousness of a society that understood, from bitter experience, exactly what happened to a naval power that lost track of the condition of its ships. The craftsmen who worked in these yards, the shipwrights, the caulkers, the rope makers, the sail makers, the painters, were specialists in a tradition of maritime knowledge that had been accumulating for centuries. They knew things about wood that took lifetimes to learn. Which timbers from which regions resisted worm best. How to read the grain of a plank to predict where it would crack under stress. How to shape a new piece so that it would fit seamlessly into the curve of a hull that had been working for years and had developed its own subtle deformations. This knowledge was not written down in manuals. It lived in hands and eyes and the accumulated experience of thousands of ships over hundreds of years. The great shipyards of the ancient world were therefore not just facilities. They were repositories of civilization's most advanced practical knowledge, concentrated in specific places, maintained by communities of craftsmen whose skills were as much a strategic asset as the ships themselves. When Carthage was destroyed by Rome in 146 BC and its harbour was deliberately demolished, what Rome was destroying was not just a port. It was a tradition of knowledge that had taken centuries to accumulate and which, once gone, could not simply be recreated. The ancient world understood this at some level. The ferocity with which maritime powers protected their harbours and their shipwrights tells you something about how clearly they saw the relationship between infrastructure and power. There is a moment in the process of hauling a ship out of the water. It comes when the keel first touches the ramp, when the weight of the vessel begins to transfer from the buoyancy of the sea to the solid resistance of the earth. That must have felt to ancient sailors like a kind of surrender. The ship that had been their world for months, the thing that moved and breathed and groaned beneath them as they moved, was now still. It was on land. It was no longer a ship in the fullest sense. It was waiting. The haul-out was not performed in silence. It was accompanied by voices, the rhythmic calls of the men managing the ropes, the responses of those positioned along the hull, the sharp instructions of the overseer who was watching the keel for any sign of uneven loading. In cultures where communal labour was organised through chant and call and response, the work song was not decoration. It was the mechanism by which the effort of dozens or hundreds of men was synchronised into something capable of moving a 40-ton ship up a stone ramp. The sea shanty tradition that persisted into the age of sail and beyond was the direct descendant of these ancient working songs, carrying in its rhythms the memory of every ship that had ever been dragged onto a beach. Different cultures approached the mechanics of the haul-out differently, and the variations are instructive. The Greeks used the slipway and ship-shed system described in the last section, permanent infrastructure designed for repeat use. But in less developed harbours, or in places where the fleet was smaller or less organised, more improvised methods were used. Ships could be careened, rolled onto their side on a beach so that the hull could be worked on, rather than fully hauled. This was less effective for structural inspection and repair, but required no permanent infrastructure, and it was practiced across the ancient world from the Mediterranean to the Indian Ocean, wherever ships were maintained without the benefit of a proper yard. The Homeric epics give us occasional glimpses of earlier practices, the ones that preceded the great institutional yards of the classical period. In the Iliad, the Greek ships beached at Troy are described as being hauled up onto the shore, propped up on timber cradles, and maintained by their crews throughout the 9 years of the siege. This is a detail that rings absolutely true to anyone who understands ancient maritime practice. An army that brought its ships to a foreign shore and expected to stay was not going to leave those ships in the water. The ships were the only way home. Their preservation was not a secondary concern. It was, in the most literal sense, a matter of survival. The care with which the beached ships at Troy are described, the way individual vessels are named, their crews identified, their condition noted, reflects the ancient understanding that a ship was a particular, individual thing. It was not interchangeable with other ships. It had its own character, its own history, its own weaknesses and strengths. The men who maintained it understood it in the way that a modern mechanic understands a specific engine they have worked on for years. not through abstract knowledge, but through intimate familiarity. They knew where this ship leaked and why. They knew which plank had been replaced last season, and whether the replacement had taken well. They knew the sound the keel made when the ship grounded on sand versus gravel. This intimate knowledge was part of what the haul-out made possible. When the ship was in the water, you could observe it from the outside, but you could not really see it. You could hear it and feel it, but the hull below the waterline was invisible, hidden in the dark water. The haul-out was the moment of revelation, the moment when you could walk around the entire vessel, crouch down and look at the keel, run your hands along the planks below the waterline, and see with your own eyes what the sea had been doing. What they found was never entirely predictable, and this unpredictability was itself part of the ritual's psychological importance. A ship that had seemed sound all season might reveal a worm infestation that had been growing invisible beneath a clean-looking surface. A plank that had been cause for concern might turn out to have held better than expected. The inspection was a reckoning, a moment when the optimistic assumptions that keep sailors at sea were replaced by the honest evidence of material reality. The inspection typically followed a specific sequence. First, the hull was cleaned, scraped free of barnacles and other fouling with iron tools, then washed down with fresh water to remove salt deposits that could accelerate wood deterioration if left to crystallize. Then came the physical examination, the overseer and lead shipwright working their way along the hull from stem to stern, tapping, probing, pressing. Suspect planks were marked. The keel was examined particularly carefully since it bore the greatest stresses in normal sailing and was the most exposed part of the hull to the various threats in the water. The garboard strakes, the planks immediately alongside the keel, came next, since they too were constantly stressed, and often the first to show signs of worm damage or rot. When a plank was condemned, it came out. This was the decisive moment that separated a genuine winter maintenance operation from a superficial one, and it was the point at which cost and prudence came into conflict. Removing and replacing a plank in a working ship hull was not a simple task. The plank was joined to its neighbours by wooden pegs, trunnels from the Old English tree nails, that had to be bored out without damaging the surrounding timber. The new plank had to be shaped to fit the curve of the hull in that specific location, a task that required considerable skill. And the new plank had to be installed in a way that made it as strong as, or stronger than the original, which meant getting the grain direction right, getting the peg spacing correct, and getting the seam caulked properly before the ship went back into the water. The caulking of the seams was itself a specialised art, and we will return to the caulkers in detail in a later section. For now, it is enough to note that the haul-out created a window of opportunity for all of this work, a period of weeks or months during which the ship was accessible, dry, and stationary, during which the craftsmen of the yard could address every problem that had accumulated over the sailing season. This window was precious. In some climates and some harbours, the winter weather itself placed constraints on when certain work could be done. It was difficult to apply pitch or tar in cold, wet weather, and the drying of freshly caulked seams required warmth and sun. The management of the winter work period was therefore not just a question of what needed to be done, but of sequencing the work to take advantage of favourable conditions. There is something else worth noting about the haul-out, something that goes beyond the purely practical. The hauled ship was visible in a way that the floating ship was not. When a trireme sat in its shed, it was on display. To the crew who would sail it, to the trierarch who owned it, to the naval officials who inspected it, to the citizens who passed by the harbour. The condition of the ship was a statement about the competence of those responsible for it, and in a culture as intensely competitive and honour-conscious as classical Athens, the condition of your trireme was a matter of public reputation. This visibility created its own kind of incentive for maintenance. A trierarch who returned his ship to the naval boards in worse condition than he had received it faced not just financial penalties but public shame. A crew whose ship showed signs of neglect reflected badly on the entire community from which they came. The social pressure that surrounded the condition of the hauled fleet was, in its way, as powerful a maintenance incentive as any regulatory system, and perhaps more reliable because it operated continuously, embedded in the culture rather than depending on the incorruptibility of inspectors. Before the Greeks built the Piraeus and before the Romans dreamed of empire on the sea, there were the Phoenicians. They are one of history's great maritime peoples, seafarers of extraordinary skill and ambition who, starting from a narrow strip of the Levantine coast roughly corresponding to modern Lebanon, planted trading colonies from Cyprus to Spain and beyond, and whose ships were carrying purple-dyed cloth, cedar timber, glass and silver across the breadth of the Mediterranean centuries before the Greek city-states had developed the kind of organised naval power that would eventually eclipse them. The Phoenicians are also one of history's great understudied civilizations. Their homeland was conquered by successive empires: Assyrian, Babylonian, Persian, Macedonian, Roman, and their own written records, maintained in a script that was the direct ancestor of every alphabet used in the Western world today, were largely destroyed or never preserved. What we know of them comes primarily from the records of other peoples, the grudging admiration of the Assyrian annals, the more detailed but often hostile accounts of the Greeks, the archaeological evidence of their colonies and their shipwrecks. Through all of these fragmentary lenses, the Phoenicians emerge as people who understood the sea with an intimacy that their contemporaries found almost uncanny. The Phoenician maritime tradition grew from a specific geographic and ecological context. The cities of the Phoenician coast, Byblos, Sidon, Tyre, Arvad, sat at the intersection of two enormous resources: the sea, which gave them their highway, and the cedar forests of the Lebanese mountains, which gave them their timber. Lebanese cedar was, by the unanimous testimony of the ancient world, the finest shipbuilding wood available in the region. It was strong, it was straight-grained, it was naturally resistant to insects and to the marine borers that destroyed lesser timbers, and it grew in abundance within dragging distance of the coast. When the ancient Egyptians wanted the best timber for their most important ships, they sent to Byblos for cedar. When Solomon built his temple in Jerusalem, the cedar came from the mountains above Tyre. The connection between Phoenician prosperity and Phoenician timber was not incidental. It was the foundation of everything. The Phoenicians' understanding of ship maintenance derived from this deep familiarity with wood and its properties. They knew their timber not just as a material to be bought and shaped, but as something they had watched grow, had selected from the forest, had seasoned and stored according to careful procedures designed to bring the wood to the optimum condition for shipbuilding. Their knowledge of which parts of a cedar tree made the best keel, which made the best planks, which made the best framing, was the accumulated wisdom of generations of craftsmen working in an unbroken tradition, and their knowledge of what that wood did in the water and what it needed to survive was equally deep. The evidence for Phoenician hauling practices is more fragmentary than for Greece or Rome, but it is consistent. Their colonial harbours, at Carthage, at Motia in Sicily, at Gadir on the Atlantic coast of Spain, were built with the same divided structure: commercial quays for merchant shipping and separate protected facilities for war vessels. The Carthaginian military harbour, with its 220 individual berths, was built to a Phoenician template and represented the logical extension of practices that had been developing in the Levantine homeland for centuries. The covered berth, the individual shed that protected a single ship from weather and observation, was a Phoenician innovation that the Greeks and Romans adopted and scaled up. One of the most revealing pieces of evidence about Phoenician maritime practice is indirect: the remarkable durability of their colonial trade networks. Carthage, founded according to tradition in the 9th century BC, maintained active commercial relationships with communities across the Western Mediterranean for 6 centuries before its destruction. The ships that sustained those relationships had to be maintained. The routes they sailed, across open water to Spain, south along the African coast through the straits into the Atlantic, were demanding enough to destroy poorly maintained vessels quickly. The longevity of the Carthaginian trading system is in itself evidence of a maintenance culture sophisticated enough to keep ships seaworthy across decades of continuous use. The Phoenicians were also the people who first systematically explored what happened when you did not haul your ships out, when you pushed the sailing season past its natural limits in pursuit of commercial advantage. The evidence here is in their wrecks. Several Phoenician shipwrecks recovered by underwater archaeologists in the Western Mediterranean date to the period between October and March, the traditional close season, and their locations and cargo configurations suggest ships that were caught by autumn storms while trying to complete one more voyage before winter. The cargoes were valuable: amphorae of wine, copper ingots, worked metal goods. The pressure to complete the return voyage before the season ended was real and understandable, and the wrecks record the consequence of yielding to that pressure. The Phoenicians also pioneered the use of protective coatings on ship hulls, the first line of chemical defense against the biological threats described in the previous section. The most ancient coating was pitch or tar, derived from the resinous timber that was abundant in the forests of the Levant. Pitch had multiple useful properties for ship maintenance. It was waterproof, it was toxic to the marine organisms that attacked wood, and when applied hot it penetrated the outer surface of the timber, filling microcracks and creating a protective barrier that slowed the entry of water and the boring of worms. The application of pitch to a freshly hauled hull was one of the first tasks of the maintenance season, and the smell of hot pitch was as characteristic of the ancient harbour in autumn as the smell of salt water was in summer. Later, Phoenician practice added other materials to the coating process. Lead sheets hammered onto the hull below the waterline, which provided a physical barrier against worm damage as well as a smooth surface that reduced drag and fouling. Lead sheathing has been found on several Phoenician-era wrecks, and while it was expensive enough to be used selectively rather than universally, its existence tells us that the Phoenicians were actively experimenting with anti-fouling technology centuries before it became standard practice in the Greek and Roman world. They were, in this as in so many other things, ahead of their time. The Phoenicians' greatest contribution to the history of ship maintenance, however, was not a specific technology but a cultural attitude. The understanding that ships were not consumable assets to be used until they failed, but capital investments to be maintained and preserved with the same care and attention that you would give to any other source of wealth. This attitude, which seems obvious when stated plainly, was not universal in the ancient world. Many cultures treated ships as relatively disposable, building new ones rather than maintaining old ones when maintenance became expensive. The Phoenicians' commercial model depended on long-distance trade that made the construction of replacement ships impractical. You could not build a new ship at Gadia to replace one lost at Tyre. You had to keep the ships you had alive for years and decades if necessary. That imperative drove the development of the entire maintenance tradition that the Greeks and Romans later inherited and institutionalized. In the spring of 483 BC, an Athenian politician named Themistocles convinced his city to make one of the most consequential decisions in the history of the ancient world. A rich vein of silver had been discovered in the state mines at Laurion, and the citizens of Athens were debating what to do with the unexpected windfall. The conventional proposal was to distribute the money among the citizenry, a direct payment to every Athenian adult male. Themistocles proposed something different. He proposed building a fleet. The argument he made, as reported by Thucydides and Herodotus, combined hard strategic calculation with visionary ambition. Athens had a long-standing conflict with its neighbour Aegina, and Themistocles used this conflict as the ostensible justification for the fleet. But the real target of his thinking was almost certainly the Persian Empire, whose invasion of Greece was already being planned and would materialize within 3 years. Themistocles understood something that many of his contemporaries did. Not that the coming conflict with Persia would ultimately be decided not on land but on water, and that Athens, with its harbour at the Piraeus, its skilled craftsmen, and its silver, had the ability to build a fleet that could dominate the Aegean. The Athenians voted for the fleet. They authorised the construction of 200 triremes, and as part of this authorisation, they committed to something that is often overlooked in the historical narratives of the Persian Wars: the infrastructure to maintain those triremes, the ship sheds, the ramps, the dry storage facilities, the workshops, the institutions for managing and maintaining the fleet. Without these, the triremes were a wasting asset, ships that would deteriorate within a few years and be unable to fight. With them, Athens had the foundation of a naval power that could project force and sustain itself across decades. The neosoikoi that were built at the Piraeus in the 480s and expanded in the following decades were engineering, achievements of real sophistication. The structures that have been excavated give us a clear picture of how they worked. The stone foundations and column bases of several sheds have been recovered, and their dimensions confirm the ancient literary sources. Sheds sized precisely for triremes, arranged in parallel rows with the ramp ends pointing toward the water. The ramps themselves were built from finely dressed stone, sloping at an angle that provided the optimal mechanical advantage for hauling, shallow enough that the pulling force could be managed, steep enough that the ship's own weight helped pull it down the ramp at launch. The internal organisation of the neosoikos was more sophisticated than a simple shelter. Inside the shed, The ship rested on wooden cradles that supported the hull at multiple points and kept it off the stone floor. These cradles were carefully shaped to match the hull form, supporting the keel and the lower planks without creating stress. Concentrations. The ship was also shored up on its sides by additional timber supports that kept it from rolling or shifting during the winter. Moving a 40-ton ship even a few centimetres in the wrong direction could crack a plank or shift a joint, so the securing of the hauled ship was taken as seriously as the hauling itself. The great innovation of the Athenian system was its scale. No previous culture had maintained a fleet as large as the one Athens built in the 5th century BC, and the management of hundreds of individual ships, each requiring its own shed, its own cradle, its own maintenance crew, its own inventory of spare parts and equipment, created administrative challenges that the Athenians met with characteristic ingenuity. The trireme catalogue inscriptions mentioned earlier are the product of this administrative system, a bureaucratic response to the complexity of managing a large industrial asset. The Athenians essentially invented the concept of fleet, management as an institutional discipline. The triarchy, the system by which wealthy Athenian citizens were assigned the command and maintenance of individual triremes, was the human mechanism that made this scale of operation possible. A triarch was responsible for equipping his trireme, hiring and paying its crew, and maintaining it in good condition throughout his year of service. This responsibility included the haul-out, ensuring that the ship was properly housed for the winter, that maintenance work was properly supervised, and that the ship was returned to the naval boards in the spring in at least as good condition as he had received it. The triarchs competed with each other. The beauty and condition of their ships was a matter of civic pride, and this competition drove standards upward in ways that no purely administrative system could have achieved. There were also the ship's overseers, the epistatai, who worked alongside the triarchs and who were responsible for the physical facilities, the condition of the sheds, the ramps, the equipment. The Athenian naval inventories record not just the state of individual ships, but the state of the shed infrastructure. Damaged columns, ramps in need of repair, faulty drainage that was allowing water to pool under ships. The whole system breathed with the institutional consciousness of an organization that understood, viscerally, what happened when maintenance slipped. What happened was the Persian Wars and their aftermath, which demonstrated the correctness of Themistocles' gamble with devastating clarity. At the Battle of Salamis in 480 BC, the Athenian fleet, those 200 triremes whose construction had seemed so extravagant to the men who voted for the direct payment, destroyed the Persian navy in the waters between Athens and the island of Salamis. The Persian ships, many of them hastily assembled and inadequately maintained, were outmaneuvered and outrowed by crews who had trained on ships kept in peak condition through years of systematic winter maintenance. After Salamis, the Persian army could no longer be supplied by sea, and the invasion collapsed. The aftermath of Salamis revealed something even more significant about the long-term power of maritime infrastructure. Athens used its naval victory to build an empire, the Delian League, which was in practice an Athenian empire maintained through naval force. The Athenian fleet was the instrument of this empire, and the fleet was possible because the infrastructure to maintain it had been built and kept functional. The long walls that connected Athens to the Piraeus, one of the great engineering projects of the classical world, were fundamentally about protecting that infrastructure, ensuring that the harbour and its shipyards could never be cut off from the city, that the fleet could always be maintained and supplied. The long walls were, in a sense, the most elaborate expression of the understanding that ship maintenance was not a detail but a strategic priority. The Romans, for most of their early history, were not a maritime people. This is one of the more surprising facts about a civilization that eventually controlled the entire coastline of the Mediterranean Sea. The Roman Republic that began its career of conquest in central Italy in the 5th and 4th centuries BC was a land power. Its armies were legions, its strategies were territorial, its virtues were the virtues of the peasant soldier rather than the sailor. The sea in early Roman thinking was a foreign element, something that separated you from the enemy rather than connecting you to him, an obstacle to be crossed rather than a medium to be exploited. This attitude began to change in the 3rd century BC, when Rome found itself in conflict with Carthage for control of the western Mediterranean. The First Punic War, which began in 264 BC, was the event that forced Rome to become a naval power, almost overnight, and the story of how it did so is one of the most remarkable episodes of institutional improvisation in ancient history. Rome, facing the most powerful naval force in the Mediterranean, essentially built a fleet from scratch, trained crews with no experience of rowing a warship, and within a few years was challenging Carthaginian naval supremacy. The famous story of the Corvus, the boarding bridge that Roman ships used to convert naval battles into the kind of infantry fighting at which Rome excelled, reflects both Roman ingenuity and Roman discomfort with the conventional tools of naval warfare. The Corvus was an admission that Rome could not yet match Carthaginian seamanship in the kind of manoeuvre and ram tactics that defined Mediterranean naval combat. Instead, Rome changed the rules, turning sea battles into land battles by the expedient of grappling the enemy ship and sending in the marines. But what concerns us here is not the tactics of the First Punic War, but the infrastructure it forced Rome to build, training sailors, equipping fleets, conducting operations across the open sea. All of these required the same basic infrastructure that the Greeks and Phoenicians had developed: proper harbours, ship sheds, maintenance facilities, and the institutional knowledge to use them. Rome acquired this knowledge partly by hiring or capturing Phoenician and Greek experts, and partly by the brutally effective method of doing it wrong until it learned to do it right. The cost of doing it wrong was catastrophic. The First Punic War saw Rome lose more ships to storms than to the Carthaginian fleet. The ancient sources record that Rome lost entire fleets, hundreds of ships and tens of thousands of men, in storm disasters that more experienced maritime powers would have avoided by simply not sailing in the wrong season. At Camarina, in 255 BC, a Roman fleet of approximately 250 ships was caught by a storm on the southern Sicilian coast, and nearly all of them were lost. At Palinurus in 253 BC, a second large fleet suffered a similar fate. These disasters were not simply the result of bad luck. They were the result of operating outside the seasonal constraints that ancient maritime experience had established, pushing the sailing calendar past the point where the sea was predictably navigable, in pursuit of strategic objectives that could not wait for spring. The Romans learned from these disasters with the same systematic thoroughness that characterized their approach to every other military challenge. They learned the sailing calendar. They learned the concept of the mare clausum, the closed sea, the period from roughly November through March during which sailing in the open Mediterranean was considered unacceptably dangerous by experienced navigators. They developed their own naval infrastructure: harbours at Ostia, at Puteoli, at Misenum, at Ravenna, the great bases from which the imperial fleet operated, and they developed the maintenance practices that kept those fleets operational. Roman naval maintenance differed from Greek practice in some significant ways, reflecting both the different character of Roman naval power and the different technological era in which it operated. The Romans relied more heavily on hired technical expertise, Greek and Phoenician shipwrights who brought their accumulated knowledge to Roman service, and rather less on the kind of citizen-led system that had maintained the Athenian fleet. Roman naval crews were primarily freedmen, slaves, and provincial recruits rather than citizens, and the social dynamics of the maintenance culture were correspondingly different. One Roman innovation in ship maintenance deserves particular attention: the development of the dry dock, a structure specifically designed to allow ships to be inspected and repaired without being completely hauled out of the water. The Roman dry dock worked by constructing a sealed chamber adjacent to the harbour that could be flooded to allow a ship to float in, then drained by pumps or siphons to leave the ship resting on a prepared floor. This was a significant advance over the slipway system because it required less effort to move the ship and caused less stress on the hull. Roman examples of what appear to be early dry dock structures have been identified at several Mediterranean harbours, though their precise function is still debated by archaeologists. The Roman period also saw significant developments in anti-fouling technology, the battle against the biological threats to ship hulls that we discussed earlier. Roman shipwrights experimented with a wider range of protective coatings than their predecessors. Pitch and tar remained the baseline, but Roman practice added arsenic compounds, sulfur, and in some cases copper-based materials that may represent an early precursor to the copper sheathing that would not become standard until the 18th century. The recipe recorded by the Roman writer Vitruvius for a protective coating for ship hulls includes ingredients that, translated into modern chemistry, represent a reasonably effective broad-spectrum antifoulant. The Romans may not have understood why these mixtures worked, but they observed that they did. What the Roman period also gives us uniquely is a legal and administrative record of ship maintenance practice. Roman law developed a sophisticated framework for the ownership, operation and maintenance of ships. Who was responsible for what standard of maintenance was legally required, what remedies were available when ships were damaged through negligence. The Digest of Justinian, the great 6th century compilation of Roman law, contains numerous passages dealing with maritime maintenance that illuminate the everyday reality of ancient ship upkeep in ways that purely technical or administrative records do not. We learn about disputes between ship owners and harbour masters over the condition of facilities. We learn about the liability of shipwrights who performed substandard repairs. We learn about the obligation of charterers to maintain ships in good order during the period of their use. These are the legal fossils of a maintenance culture so embedded in everyday commercial life that it generated litigation, and therefore records, at every level. Turn the calendar forward several centuries and move the scene from the warm waters of the Mediterranean to the grey, cold, storm-racked coasts of northern Europe. Here the seasonal imperative was not just about biological threats to wooden ships, though the worms and barnacles of the North Sea were real enough, but about something more fundamental: ice. In the Norse world, the question of when to haul your ship out of the water was answered, in many regions, by the simple fact that if you did not do it before the sea froze, the sea would do it for you in a way that left very little of the ship intact. The Viking Age, which began in the late 8th century AD with the raid on Lindisfarne in 793 and extended through the 11th century, produced some of the most sophisticated wooden vessels the world had ever seen. The clinker-built longship, constructed from overlapping planks riveted together with a shallow draft that allowed it to be beached on open shores and rowed up rivers, was a technological achievement of such elegance that naval architects today still study its design with admiration. The Oseberg ship, excavated from a burial mound in Norway in 1904 and now preserved in Oslo, is over 1,000 years old and still breathtaking in the perfection of its construction. The curves of its hull have the quality of something grown rather than built, each plank flowing into the next in a rhythm that speaks of craftsmen who had internalized the mathematics of the sea. The Viking longship was extraordinary, partly because it was designed with its own maintenance requirements built into its construction philosophy. The clinker-built hull was flexible by design. The overlapping planks moved slightly relative to each other in response to wave action, distributing stresses across the whole structure rather than concentrating them in individual joints. This flexibility made the ship more seaworthy in rough conditions and also made it easier to repair. A damaged plank could be removed and replaced without disturbing the structural integrity of the hull in the way that Carvel-built hulls, with their edge-to-edge plank connections, were affected by plank removal. The Norse winter haul-out was a community event of the first order. The longship was not simply an economic asset or a military tool. In Norse culture, it was a sacred object, intimately connected with ideas of honour, adventure, and the passage between the world of the living and the world of the dead. The ship burial, the practice of interring important individuals in their ships with their possessions and sometimes their servants, tells you something profound about how the Norse conceived of the relationship between a person and their vessel. The ship was not just a vehicle. It was a companion, an extension of its owner's identity, an object of spiritual significance that deserved the same ritual care as any other sacred thing. The haul-out in the Norse tradition was therefore performed with a consciousness of this significance. The ship was addressed, spoken to, treated as a being with a kind of agency, and the work of hauling and maintaining it was understood as a relationship of mutual obligation. You cared for the ship because the ship had carried you and would carry you again, and the quality of your care was a measure of the quality of your relationship with the sea. Norse saga literature is full of passages in which ships are described with the kind of affectionate attention to individual character that modern writers give to people. This ship is known for its speed, that one for its stability in rough water, a third for the particular quality of its steering that only an experienced hand can fully appreciate. The physical process of hauling a Viking longship was different from the Mediterranean slipway system in ways that reflected the different environment and the different character of the ships. The longship's shallow draft meant that it could be rowed directly onto a suitable beach, and its relatively light construction, the clinker hull was much lighter per unit of displacement than the heavier Mediterranean warships, meant that it could be hauled by a smaller team. Norse sources describe ships being pulled by their crews, with rollers under the keel, up onto gravel beaches or into purpose-built boathouses called naust. The naust was the Norse equivalent of the Greek neosoikos, a long, low building, open at the water end, sized to shelter a single ship. Thousands of naust were built along the coasts of Scandinavia, during the Viking Age and after, and many of their foundations are still visible today. Long rectangular depressions in the coastal landscape that correspond precisely to the dimensions of specific ship types. The archaeology of the naust sites tells a story of continuous use over generations, floors worn smooth by the passage of ship hulls, post holes from successive rebuildings, deposits of organic material including wood shavings, pitch, and the remains of the various materials used in maintenance work. The Norse winter maintenance season was a period of intense practical activity, but also of social gathering. The work of repairing and refitting a ship drew together the craftsmen of the community, the blacksmith who made new rivets and iron fittings, the rope maker who replaced worn rigging, the sail maker who repaired or replaced the woolen sail, the shipwright who addressed structural damage. This gathering of skilled people in a shared space working toward a common goal was a social event as much as an industrial one. The naust in winter was a place where news was exchanged, disputes were settled, alliances were formed, and the plans for the coming season took shape. The materials used in Norse ship maintenance had their own particular character, reflecting the resources of the northern environment. Pine tar, produced by the slow burning of pine roots in stone kilns, was the standard coating material for Norse hulls, and the smell of pine tar is so deeply embedded in Scandinavian maritime culture that it still carries emotional resonance today. Pine tar was effective as a wood preservative and antifoulant, penetrating the grain of the timber and sealing it against both water absorption and biological attack. It smelled wonderful in a way that pitch and tar did not, clean and resinous rather than acrid, and it was produced locally in quantities that made it one of the defining commodities of the Norse maritime economy. The woolen sail of the Viking ship was another component that required intensive winter maintenance. Wool, unlike the linen or papyrus fibre sails used in the Mediterranean world, was warm and strong but required regular treatment with animal fat or lanolin to maintain its water resistance and flexibility. An untreated woolen sail became stiff and heavy when wet, losing the aerodynamic quality that made it useful. A well-treated sail was supple and water-shedding, able to capture wind in conditions where a deteriorated sail would have been useless. The preparation of sails in the winter shed, the washing, stretching, treating, and careful storage, was the kind of skilled work that was understood to determine whether the coming season's voyages succeeded or failed. On the other side of the world from the Viking shores of Scandinavia, a completely different maritime tradition had developed a completely different relationship with the seasons. In the Indian Ocean, the determining factor was not ice, or the arrival of autumn storms, but the monsoon, the great seasonal reversal of wind direction that made the Indian Ocean, uniquely among the world's major maritime zones, a place where the timing of voyages was determined not by the sailor but by the atmosphere. The monsoon system works as follows. From roughly April to September, the southwest monsoon blows consistently from the southwest, carrying moisture from the Indian Ocean over the subcontinent. From roughly October to March, the northeast monsoon reverses the pattern, blowing consistently from the northeast. For the sailors of the Indian Ocean, the Arab, Indian, Malay, East African and Persian communities, who had been navigating these waters since at least the 2nd millennium BC, the monsoon was the engine of their entire maritime economy. You sailed east and north on the southwest monsoon. You sailed west and south on the northeast monsoon. The timing of your departures and arrivals was determined by the monsoon calendar with a precision that would have astonished the seasonal navigators of the Mediterranean. The vessel that most perfectly embodied this monsoon-driven maritime world was the dhow, a term that covers a family of vessel types, built to a tradition that stretches back at least 2,000 years and that persists in attenuated form to the present day. The dhow was built without nails. This is the single most striking fact about it to anyone familiar with European or Mediterranean ship construction. The planks of the hull were fastened together not with iron pegs or copper rivets, but with cord, coconut fibre cord, braided into rope and stitched through holes bored in the planks in a technique called sewn construction. The ship was literally sewn together, and the result was a vessel of remarkable flexibility, and in some circumstances remarkable durability. This sewn construction technique had implications for maintenance that were completely different from those of nailed or pegged vessels. In a conventional wooden ship, the fasteners, the pegs or nails that hold the planks together, were the critical structural elements, and they were also the most vulnerable to corrosion and deterioration. In a dhow, the cord fastenings could be renewed without dismantling the hull. You could cut out a worn section of lashing, thread new cord through the existing holes, and retie it, all without disturbing the surrounding structure. This made the dhow extraordinarily easy to maintain at sea. Running repairs were possible in a way that they were not on nailed vessels, and it also made the winter maintenance period a different kind of operation. The monsoon calendar dictated when ships could sail and when they could not, and the period between monsoons, approximately October through November, and again in April through May, the transition periods when the winds were unreliable, was the natural time for intensive maintenance. Ships that had made the long voyage from Arabia to India on the southwest monsoon would spend these transition months in the harbours of the Malabar coast or the Gulf of Cambat, where the skilled shipwrights of the Indian Ocean world could address whatever the voyage had inflicted on the hull. The great ports that served this purpose, Calicut, Ceylon, Muscat, Aden, Hormuz, were not just trading centres but maintenance hubs, places where the expertise and materials required to keep the dhow fleet operational were concentrated. The coir rope used for the lashing was produced in the Maldive Islands and exported throughout the Indian Ocean world, a commodity trade that was itself driven by the maintenance requirements of the ship fleet. Coconut oil, which was used both as a wood preservative and as a lubricant for the stitching, was produced along the Kerala coast. The particular timber used for dhow construction, primarily teak, from the forests of India and mainland Southeast Asia, was selected and seasoned according to traditions as carefully developed as anything in the Phoenician or Greek world. The Arab sailors who dominated the Western Indian Ocean trade from roughly the 7th century AD onward brought to this existing tradition their own sophisticated understanding of seasonal navigation and ship maintenance. Arab geographical and navigational literature is rich with practical knowledge about the sea. The texts of writers like Al-Masudi and Ibn Majid combine precise navigational instruction with meteorological observation and practical advice about ship management that reads, across the centuries, as the voice of genuine expertise. Ibn Majid, the 15th century Arab navigator whose works survive in greater detail than most of his predecessors, describes the maintenance requirements of long-distance dhow voyages with a directness that leaves no doubt about the consequences of neglect. Hulls that are not properly treated will open at sea. Lashings that are not renewed will fail without warning. Sails that are not properly maintained will be useless when you need them most. The Indian Ocean world also developed its own tradition of the ship as a sacred object, and the maintenance practices of the dhow tradition carried their own religious and ritual dimensions. The launching of a newly built or refitted vessel was accompanied by prayers, the recitation of protective verses, the sacrifice of animals whose blood was spilled on the keel, a practice that has parallels in every maritime culture from the Mediterranean to the Pacific, and speaks to something deep in the human experience of venturing onto the water. The care taken of the ship was not just technical but devotional, an expression of the relationship between the sailor and the divine forces that governed the sea. The monsoon-driven seasonal cycle of the Indian Ocean dhow trade also produced its own distinctive winter economy. Ships that could not sail during the transition periods became floating warehouses, moored in harbour and serving as storage and trading platforms while their hulls were worked on. The harbour communities that served them developed economic relationships with the ship crews that were as much about maintenance as about trade. The rope maker and the sail mender and the caulker and the carpenter all needed the ships to arrive with work to be done, just as the ships needed the harbour community to provide the skills and materials to keep them operational. We have met the shipworm already, that invisible destroyer boring its patient way through the planks of every wooden ship that ever sailed the warmer seas. But the biological war against ancient ships was fought on multiple fronts simultaneously, and to understand the full scale of the maintenance challenge, we need to look at the entire ecology of the sea as it related to ships' hulls. Because the ocean, it turns out, is extraordinarily good at colonizing any solid surface that appears within it, and a ship's hull, from the ocean's perspective, was simply an artificial reef waiting to happen. The process began within hours of a ship's hull entering the water. First came the bacteria, invisible, ubiquitous, coating every submerged surface within minutes of immersion in a thin biofilm that ancient shipwrights knew nothing about, but whose existence was the necessary precondition for everything that followed. The bacterial biofilm changed the surface chemistry of the wood, making it more attractive to the next wave of colonizers, the diatoms, single-celled algae that form a visible slime on submerged surfaces within days. The diatom film was not itself structurally damaging, but it was the foundation on which the more destructive colonizers would subsequently build. After the diatoms came the barnacles. The larvae of barnacles, free swimming in the water column, were drawn to surfaces coated with the bacterial and diatom biofilm and settled in enormous numbers, cementing their shells to the wood and beginning the rapid growth that would, within weeks, cover a ship's hull in a rough, drag-increasing crust. A fully fouled hull might have barnacle accumulations several centimetres thick, and the weight and drag this added was not trivial. Ancient naval architects calculated speed with obsessive precision. The difference between a trireme that could make 8 knots and one that could make 7 knots was the difference between catching the enemy and being caught, and a fouled hull was a measurable performance degradation that translated directly into tactical disadvantage. The seaweeds came next, or simultaneously with the barnacles depending on conditions. Green and brown algae colonized the hull in the middle and lower ranges of the waterline, adding to the drag and creating an environment that was congenial to yet more organisms. The submerged hull of a ship that had been at sea for a full sailing season was not a wooden structure with a slight coating. It was a functioning ecosystem, with multiple layers of organisms competing and cooperating in ways that progressively degraded the hull's performance and structural integrity. But all of these surface colonizers, damaging as they were secondary to the deep threat, the boring organisms that penetrated the wood itself. We have talked about the shipworm at length, but Teredo nivalis was not the only species in this category. Several species of crustacean, the gribble, Limnoria lignorum being the most notorious, also bored into submerged wood, though in a different way. Where the shipworm created deep, branching tunnels through the wood's interior, the gribble ate from the surface inward, excavating shallow channels. In the outer layers that gave the surface of an infested plank a distinctive rough-pitted texture. Gribble damage exposed the unprotected interior of the wood to water penetration and subsequent fungal attack, creating a cascading series of deterioration processes that could destroy a plank far faster than either threat acting alone. In tropical and subtropical waters, the southern Mediterranean, the Red Sea, the Indian Ocean, the Atlantic coast of Africa, the biological threats were particularly severe. The shipworm species of tropical waters grew faster, penetrated deeper, and reproduced more aggressively than their temperate counterparts. Ancient sources that deal specifically with tropical voyaging of the periplus of the Erythraean Sea, the Arab geographical texts, are notably more emphatic about the maintenance requirements of ships operating in these regions, and the intervals between haul-outs in tropical conditions were correspondingly shorter than in cooler waters. The ancient world's response to this biological assault was a combination of physical, chemical, and operational strategies. Physically, the selection of wood species for hull construction took careful account of the known resistance of different timbers to worm and rot. Teak, as mentioned in the Indian Ocean context, was prized throughout the maritime world for its natural durability. The oils it contains are genuinely effective at repelling worm and resisting fungal attack. Oak, the standard European shipbuilding timber, was more vulnerable but was used because it combined good structural properties with reasonable availability. Elm, peculiarly resistant to water penetration, was often used for keel timbers, which were the most continuously submerged part of the hull. The chemical strategy centred on the hull coatings. Pitch and tar, as we have seen, were the baseline. But the ancient world experimented constantly with additives that might improve anti-fouling performance. Arsenic compounds mixed into pitch, the presence of which has been detected in the residue of ancient hull coatings, would have been genuinely effective at killing the organisms that tried to establish themselves on the coated surface. Sulphur, brimstone, which was available throughout the Mediterranean region from volcanic deposits, appears in several ancient recipes for hull treatment, and again would have had real anti-fouling properties. The empirical tradition of shipbuilding accumulated over centuries a body of practical chemistry that worked, not because the practitioners understood why it worked, but because they could observe that ships treated with certain combinations of materials fouled more slowly than ships treated with other combinations. The operational strategy was the haul-out itself, the seasonal removal from the water that broke the cycle of colonization and penetration. But even between haul-outs, experienced captains and crews managed their ships' exposure to fouling by choosing anchorages carefully. Fresh water was less hospitable to marine borers than salt water. A ship that spent significant time in a river estuary, where the salinity was low, would accumulate less worm damage than one that was always at anchor in deep salt water. Ancient sailors knew this, and the records of ship movements in ancient ports show a pattern of movement between anchorages that makes more sense when read through the lens of fouling management than through any other interpretation. Of all the craftsmen who kept ancient ships alive, the caulker occupies a peculiar position. The shipwright who built and repaired the structural hull was an obvious master craftsman. His work was visible, architectural, demonstrably skillful. The sailmaker and the rigger worked with materials that were clearly specialized. But the caulker worked with a material, oakum, pitch, tar, and later cotton and lead. That seemed almost too simple for the importance of his function. The caulker's job was to fill the seams between the planks and keep them filled, and the material he used was essentially organic fibre hammered into a gap and then sealed with a waterproofing compound. It seems humble. It was not. The consequences of inadequate caulking range from maddening inconvenience, a persistent leak that required the bilge pumps to be operated continuously, which on an ancient ship meant that some portion of the crew was always bailing instead of rowing or sailing, to catastrophe, a seam that opened suddenly under stress, allowing the sea to enter faster than it could be controlled. Ancient ships did not sink gradually and gracefully, the way they tend to in dramatic reconstructions. A significant seam failure on a working ship in conditions of any stress could fill the bilge in minutes, and the bilge of a fully loaded trireme or merchant vessel was a confined, dark space with no room for the kind of organized damage control that could stop the process once it had started. The seams in a wooden ship worked constantly. Every wave, every change in wind direction, every adjustment of the rigging transmitted stress through the hull in ways that caused the planks to flex, open, close, and flex again. Over a sailing season, this constant movement loosened the caulking, worked it out of the seam, compressed it in some places and stretched it in others, and eventually created places where the seal was inadequate. The haul-out was when all of this progressive deterioration was addressed systematically. The process began with a careful examination of every seam. The caulker, working with a mallet and a caulking iron, a wedge-shaped tool designed to probe the seam's depth and condition, went over the entire hull, tapping and probing, assessing whether the existing caulking was still serviceable or needed to be removed and replaced. This examination was its own skill. A sound seam has a particular resistance to the probe, a particular acoustic quality when tapped, that an experienced caulker could read as precisely as a doctor reads a pulse. A seam that needed work had a different feel and a different sound, and the difference was not always obvious to an untrained observer. Where recaulking was required, and on a ship that had spent a full season at sea this was usually most of the hull, the old caulking material was raked out with a picking iron and the seam cleaned back to bare wood. The depth of the seam was assessed, and the new caulking material was prepared. In the Mediterranean tradition, the primary caulking material was oakum, fibres of hemp rope that had been untwisted and teased into loose strands. The oakum was rolled into thick strands, twisted slightly for coherence, and then driven into the seam with a caulking iron and mallet in a controlled, rhythmic process that required considerable physical strength and good technique. The driving of the caulking was both science and art. Drive it too loosely and the seam would not be watertight. The fibres would be too compressed to fill the gap completely. Drive it too hard and you risk splitting the plank or opening an adjacent seam. The correct driving pressure, maintained consistently over hundreds of meters of seam across the hull of a large ship, required a combination of trained muscle memory and continuous tactile feedback that took years to develop. A skilled caulker could work for hours maintaining the exact same mallet force, while the rhythm of his strokes adapted automatically to the varying hardness and depth of the seams he encountered. Once the oakum was driven home, the seams were sealed with pitch, heated to the point of fluidity and poured or brushed into the seam over the oakum, filling any remaining voids and creating a waterproof outer barrier. The pitch had to be at the right temperature. Too hot and it would penetrate too deeply, flowing through the oakum and running out. The back of the seam, too cool and it would not flow freely enough to fill the seam completely. Ancient caulkers heated their pitch in iron pots and tested its consistency with a stick, developing by experience the ability to judge the temperature by colour and viscosity rather than with any instrument. The smells of the caulking operation, hot pitch, oakum, pine tar, were the definitive smells of the ancient harbour in autumn, as immediately recognisable as the smell of fresh bread was to the bakery. They penetrated everything: the clothes of the workmen, the timber of the shed, the air for hundreds of metres around the yard. Ancient writers who describe harbour scenes in autumn almost invariably mention these smells, and they do so with a vividness that suggests sensory memory. The smell of pitch in the autumn was as reliably associated with the change of seasons as the smell of fermenting grapes. The caulker's work extended beyond the seams to the fastening, the wooden pegs and later iron bolts that held the planks to the framing and to each other. Over time and use, the holes around fastenings could elongate and open, creating paths for water entry that were independent of the seam caulking. These had to be addressed by redriving the existing fastenings, or by boring new holes and inserting new fastenings, plugging the old holes with wooden bungs coated in pitch. Again, this sounds simple, and again it required a level of skill and precision that years of training were needed to develop. Lead sheathing, where it was used, added another dimension to the caulker's repertoire. Thin sheets of lead were hammered onto the hull below the waterline, attached with bronze nails. Iron nails caused electrolytic corrosion when used with lead, and the joints between sheets sealed with pitch. The application of lead sheathing required careful attention to the curves of the hull, since lead sheet that was not precisely shaped to the hull surface would create voids behind it that accumulated water and promoted the very rot it was supposed to prevent. A badly sheathed hull was worse than an unsheathed one, and the skill of correctly sheathing a complex hull form was recognised as a significant expertise in its own right. The practical reasons for hauling ships ashore in winter were compelling enough on their own terms. The worms, the rot, the storms, the accumulated damage of a season's sailing. Any one of these would have justified the practice. But the ancient world did not compartmentalise its life into the practical and the spiritual in the way that modern secular consciousness tends to do. The sailor who hauled his ship out of the water at the end of the sailing season was not just performing a maintenance procedure. He was performing an act with religious significance, marking a transition in the sacred calendar and acknowledging the power of forces that were larger than himself. In the Greek world, the sea was the domain of Poseidon, not just metaphorically, but in a literal and operational sense that shaped every decision a sailor made. Poseidon was not a distant abstraction, but an immediate presence, capricious and powerful, whose moods were visible in the behaviour of the sea. The storms that drowned men and sank ships were not accidents, or the result of impersonal meteorological processes. They were expressions of divine will, and the prudent sailor managed his relationship with Poseidon as carefully as he managed the condition of his ship. The sailing calendar, with its well-defined opening and closing dates, was as much a religious document as a practical one. The season began and ended with specific rituals directed at Poseidon, and the haul-out at the end of the season was accompanied by prayers of thanksgiving for safe return, and by offerings at the harbourside temples that were as regular a feature of ancient ports as the ship sheds themselves. The opening of the sailing season had its own ceremony. The ploia, the day when ships first put to sea in spring, was marked by a festival that varied in its specifics across the Greek world but shared a common structure. The fleet was ritually purified. Priests conducted ceremonies at the water's edge, sacrifices were made, the ships were decorated, and the first launch of the season was performed with an awareness of its symbolic weight. You were crossing a threshold, entering the sacred space of the sea, and you were doing so with the intention of returning, an intention that needed divine endorsement. The Roman sailing calendar formalized this religious dimension in a characteristically Roman way, integrating it into the civic and religious calendar of the state. The Navigia Mercedes, the Ship of Isis festival, celebrating the Egyptian goddess who had become one of the primary divine patrons of sailors in the Roman Mediterranean, marked the official opening of the sailing season in early March with a procession to the sea in which a model ship was launched as an offering. The Venalia, a festival in late August, was associated with the transition period when summer sailing began to give way to the more dangerous conditions of early autumn. These festivals were not decorations on the surface of the practical maritime world. They were embedded in the working calendar in ways that shaped real decisions about when ships sailed and when they did not. The Norse world had its own divine framework for maritime activity, equally concrete in its implications for ship management. Njord, the god of the sea and wind, governed the sailing season, and his relationship with the land god Odin reflected the seasonal alternation between the sea world of summer and the land world of winter that structured Norse life. The ceremonies that accompanied the hauling of a ship were not just social occasions, they were religious events, and the invocations that were spoken over the ship in the Norse, asking for its preservation through the winter and its safe return to service in the spring, were addressed to specific divine powers whose attention it was important to have. The sacred calendar also created a powerful system of social enforcement around the maintenance practices it sanctioned. If the correct time to haul your ship out was determined not just by practical weather patterns, but by religious prescription, then a captain who kept his ship in the water past the appointed time was not just being imprudent, he was being impious. He was challenging the divine order of things, setting his own judgment above that of the gods and the accumulated wisdom of the tradition. In cultures where impiety had real social consequences, where your neighbours and your community judged you by your relationship with the sacred, this was a serious deterrent against the kind of short-term commercial thinking that might otherwise tempt a captain to stay at sea one voyage too long. There is also a dimension here that connects the religious and the astronomical. The ancient world calibrated its sailing seasons partly by the stars. The Pleiades, the star cluster known today by that name, were used as a celestial clock for the Mediterranean sailing season. The heliacal rising of the Pleiades in mid-May was associated with the opening of the sailing season, and their setting in November was associated with its close. Hesiod, writing in the 8th century BC, refers to these celestial markers in a farming context. The Pleiades govern not just sailing but ploughing and harvest. And this connection between celestial time, agricultural time, and maritime time illustrates how completely integrated the ancient seasonal calendar was. The haul-out happened when the stars said it should, and the stars were not just astronomical phenomena, but divine signals, messages written in the sky by powers that had arranged the universe for a purpose. The mystery religions of the ancient world, the Eleusinian mysteries, the Dionysian cults, the cult of Isis and Osiris, also intersected with maritime culture in ways that went beyond the obvious. The symbolism of the sea as a realm of death and rebirth, of the ship as a vehicle for passage between worlds, was central to several of these religious traditions, and the seasonal rhythm of the maritime world, departure, voyage, return, launch, sail, haul out, mapped naturally onto the mythological structures of the mystery cults. The ship that went into the water in spring and came out in autumn was enacting at some level the same cycle of descent and return that the mystery initiate enacted in the rituals of the cult. The religious and practical dimensions of the haul-out were embedded in an economic reality that shaped both of them. Ships were expensive, and the decisions about when to sail and when to maintain were decisions with major financial implications that touched everyone connected to the maritime economy, from the ship owner down to the stevedore on the dock. In the ancient Mediterranean world, a trireme was one of the most expensive pieces of equipment that a city-state or individual could own. The timber alone, selected cedars, oaks, and firs, seasoned for the right period, shaped and transported to the building site, represented a capital investment that could exceed the annual income of a prosperous merchant. Add the cost of the skilled labour to build the hull, the rigging, the sails, the oars. A trireme needed 170 oars, each one a craftsman's work, the bronze rams, the equipment for the crew, and the operating costs of fitting out and provisioning for a season, and the total investment was staggering. Maintenance was therefore not a cost that could be avoided. It was the mechanism by which the enormous initial investment was preserved and extended. A trireme or merchant galley that was properly maintained could serve for 20 or 30 years. An poorly maintained ship deteriorated rapidly, losing structural integrity and performance until it became a hazard rather than an asset. The economics of maritime power were inseparable from the economics of maintenance, and cultures that understood this, the Athenians, the Rhodians, the Carthaginians, tended to extract far more value from their naval investments than those that did not. The merchant shipping sector had its own economic calculus around the haul-out. Commercial ships, unlike warships, were not maintained by a state institution but by their owners, who were typically private individuals or small partnerships. The decision about when to haul out and how much to spend on maintenance was therefore a private economic decision, made by people who were directly exposed to the financial consequences of getting it wrong. Get the timing wrong and sail too late into autumn, and you risked losing the ship entirely, and with it the cargo, the crew, and your investment. Underinvest in maintenance, and the ship deteriorated to the point where it could not carry full cargo loads, or where it was refused entry to harbours that had standards for the condition of vessels they admitted, or where it eventually sank with the same catastrophic financial consequences as the autumn storm. The ancient world developed a sophisticated financial industry around these risks, maritime loans. The bottomry loan, a form of financing in which money was lent against the security of a ship or its cargo, with the loan repayable only if the ship completed its voyage safely, was the primary financial instrument of the ancient maritime economy, and its terms reflected the seasonal risk calculus precisely. Interest rates on bottomry loans varied significantly depending on the time of year. A loan made in spring for a summer voyage carried much lower interest than a loan made in late summer for an autumn voyage, reflecting the greater probability of storm damage or loss as the season advanced. Lenders in Athens and later in Rome employed people who knew the seas well enough to assess the risk of specific voyages at specific times of year, and the prices they charged for their money encoded this accumulated meteorological knowledge. The legal texts that discuss bottomry loans also reveal the role of maintenance in the commercial calculus. The standard bottomry contract in the Greek world included provisions for the condition of the ship. A loan made on a ship that was not seaworthy could be voided. A borrower who misrepresented the condition of his vessel was liable to severe penalties. This meant that the question of whether a ship was properly maintained was not just a practical question, but a legal one, with financial implications that gave ship owners powerful incentives to invest in maintenance rather than defer it. The winter market that developed around the hauled fleet was itself a significant economic phenomenon. The concentrated demand for maintenance materials, timber, pitch, oakum, rope, iron fittings, sailcloth, created a seasonal market in harbour towns that was as important to local economies as the trading season itself. The craftsmen of the boatyard worked year-round. The summer, when ships were at sea, saw them making replacement equipment and doing preparatory work. The autumn and winter, when the fleet was hauled, was the intensive maintenance period. The suppliers of raw materials, timber merchants, rope makers, pitch producers, structured their own production cycles around the maintenance calendar, ensuring that supplies arrived in the harbour towns when they were needed. This created, in the harbour towns of the ancient maritime world, a distinctly layered economy, a summer economy dominated by the loading and unloading of cargo, the provisioning of departing ships, and the processing of arrived goods, and a winter economy centred on the physical maintenance of the fleet and the preparation of supplies for the next season. The winter economy was less visible than the summer one. It generated less dramatic movement of goods and people, but it was equally essential, and the harbour communities that supported it developed specialist skills and social structures that persisted across generations. The taxation of maritime commerce in the ancient world also created an institutional interest in the maintenance calendar. Harbour taxes, collected on goods unloaded or loaded, were a major source of revenue for states that controlled important ports. The seasonal pattern of this revenue, high in summer, low in winter, had to be managed in state finances, and the transitions between seasons were points of vulnerability. A state that was heavily dependent on maritime tax revenues, Athens' income from the Piraeus was a significant fraction of its total state income at the height of its power, had a structural interest in ensuring that the sailing season started as early and ended as late as possible. The tension between this fiscal interest and the practical constraints imposed by weather and maintenance needs was a recurring theme in ancient maritime administration. When the Western Roman Empire collapsed in the 5th century AD, the eastern half, the empire that we call Byzantine but which always called itself simply Roman, continued for another 1,000 years, and with it continued the maritime traditions that had been developing in the Mediterranean since before recorded history. The Byzantine Empire was a maritime state in a way that Rome in its western phase had never entirely been. Constantinople sat on the waterway connecting the Black Sea to the Aegean, controlling the flow of trade between two entire worlds, and the Byzantine fleet was the instrument by which that control was exercised. The Byzantine maintenance tradition represented the accumulated refinement of practices stretching back through Rome to Greece and Phoenicia, adapted to the specific conditions of the medieval Mediterranean and the specific character of Byzantine naval technology. The Byzantine warship of the early medieval period was the dromon, or oared galley, that evolved from the Roman trireme through a series of modifications that included changes to the oar arrangement, the addition of permanent catapults and fire-throwing equipment, and the development of larger hulls capable of carrying heavier armament. The dromon was a more complex vessel than the trireme, with more equipment that could fail and more systems that required regular maintenance. But the fundamental maintenance logic was the same. Haul it out in winter, dry it out, inspect it, repair it, and put it back in the water in spring. Byzantine naval administration was, characteristically for that intensely bureaucratic civilization, extraordinarily well documented. The Naumachika, the naval manual attributed to the Emperor Leo VI in the late 9th century, is one of the most comprehensive discussions of naval administration in the ancient and medieval world, and it includes substantial sections on maintenance and logistics that tell us in considerable detail how the Byzantine fleet was kept operational. The text discusses the proper intervals for hauling out warships, the standards for inspecting hull condition, the materials to be used in repairs, and the administrative procedures for accounting for the condition of fleet assets. Reading it alongside the earlier Athenian ship catalogues, you're struck by the continuity. The same concerns, the same standards, the same institutional consciousness that understood maintenance as a strategic priority. Greek fire, the incendiary weapon that was the Byzantine fleet's most fearsome technological asset, added a new dimension to the maintenance challenge. The projectors used to throw Greek fire were complex mechanisms of bronze and copper that required their own specialized maintenance, and the material of Greek fire itself, whatever exactly it was, and the question is still debated, required careful storage and handling that created both logistical and safety challenges at every fleet base. The combination of conventional hull maintenance and the management of fire projection equipment made the Byzantine naval base a more complex environment than anything the classical world had operated. The harbours of Constantinople were among the most sophisticated naval facilities in the medieval world. The Golden Horn, the natural harbour formed by the inlet on the northern side of the city, had facilities for both warships and merchant vessels, with the warship facilities concentrated in protected inner harbours where security could be maintained. The arsenal at Constantinople, the imperial shipyard that built, stored and maintained the fleet, was an institution of considerable antiquity by the Middle Byzantine period, and the skills concentrated there represented a tradition stretching back centuries. When the empire lost territory and resources, the arsenal was one of the last institutions to be allowed to deteriorate, because the men who ran Byzantine strategy understood clearly that without a functional fleet, the city itself was vulnerable. The Byzantine period also saw the development of the trefoil harbour, a specialised harbour design in which 3 separate basins were arranged around a central work area, allowing warships to be hauled out from multiple directions simultaneously and increasing the throughput of the maintenance operation during the brief windows between sailing seasons. This design, documented in Byzantine sources and partially confirmed by archaeological evidence, represented a genuine advance in maintenance infrastructure design that suggests the kind of sustained institutional investment in the problem that only a state with a long-term maritime strategy would make. Perhaps the most revealing aspect of the Byzantine inheritance is the evidence for what happened to maintenance standards when the empire was under severe pressure. The late Byzantine period, from the 13th century onward, when the empire had been weakened by the Fourth Crusade and was fighting a losing battle for survival against multiple enemies, shows in the naval records a progressive deterioration of fleet maintenance that tracks precisely with the empire's political and economic decline. Ships went without their regular haul-outs. Repairs were deferred. The expertise concentrated in the arsenal began to dissipate as craftsmen sought more stable employment elsewhere. The fleet that had been the backbone of Byzantine power for centuries became, in the final decades of the empire, a ghost fleet. The ships were there on paper, but many of them were barely seaworthy, maintained at a level that satisfied the bureaucratic record, but not the practical requirements of naval service. When Constantinople finally fell to the Ottomans in 1453, one of the first things the new rulers did was assess the state of the Byzantine naval infrastructure and begin the process of rebuilding it. The Ottomans, who had the ambition to become a Mediterranean naval power, understood that they were inheriting not just a city but a tradition of maritime knowledge, infrastructure and practice that had been accumulating for 15 centuries and that, even in its decayed state, contained irreplaceable expertise. The Ottoman fleet that would eventually challenge Venice and Spain for control of the Mediterranean was built, literally and institutionally, on the foundations of the Byzantine inheritance. The fall of the Western Roman Empire in the 5th century AD did not immediately destroy the maritime infrastructure of the Western Mediterranean, but it disrupted it severely, and the recovery was slow and uneven. In the chaos of the post-Roman centuries, the Great Migration period, the establishment of barbarian kingdoms in Gaul, Spain and Italy, the transformation of the Mediterranean trade networks, the systematic institutional maintenance culture that had sustained the Roman fleet gave way to something more ad hoc and locally variable. Ships were still built and maintained, but the great institutional yards of the Roman period disappeared or contracted, and with them some of the accumulated specialist knowledge that had made those yards so effective. The recovery came from unexpected directions. In the north, the Viking tradition maintained a vigorous maritime culture throughout the so-called Dark Ages, and Viking techniques and personnel diffused into the maritime cultures of England, Ireland, Normandy, and eventually the Mediterranean itself, as Norman adventurers carried their shipbuilding and sailing knowledge south. In the east, Byzantine and Arab maritime traditions continued without interruption. In the Western Mediterranean, it was the Italian city-states, Venice above all, but also Genoa, Pisa and Amalfi, that rebuilt the infrastructure of organised naval power. Venice's arsenal, founded in 1104 according to the traditional date, though the institution clearly had earlier precursors, was the single most impressive achievement in the history of naval maintenance infrastructure before the industrial era. At its height in the 14th and 15th centuries, the arsenal was a walled city within a city, a complex of shipyards, storage buildings, foundries, rope walks, and administrative facilities covering an area of about 60 hectares and employing thousands of workers in a partially proto-industrial production system that could, in an emergency, outfit a complete warship from stored components in a single day. The arsenal's significance for the history of ship maintenance was not just its scale, but its organisational principles. The Venetians had developed, through long experience, a systematic approach to the management of fleet assets that went beyond anything the classical world had achieved in terms of organisational sophistication. Ships were built to standardised dimensions that allowed components, planks, frames, oars, spars, rigging elements to be manufactured in advance and stored, ready to be fitted to any vessel of the appropriate type. This standardisation was revolutionary. It meant that the maintenance of the fleet was not dependent on the improvisation of individual craftsmen but could be planned in advance, with known quantities of materials and known amounts of labour required for each maintenance task. The arsenal's rope walk, the long straight building in which rope was twisted, was itself a marvel of functional design. Hemp rope was one of the most maintenance-intensive components of a medieval warship's equipment. It stretched, it rotted in salt air, it chafed against fittings, it needed to be replaced regularly. The Venetian rope walk produced rope to standardised specifications in quantities that kept the entire fleet supplied, and the hemp for that rope was grown in specially designated agricultural areas on the Italian mainland, ensuring supply security in a way that would have been the envy of any earlier maritime power. The arsenal also housed the fleet during the winter. The covered slips that lined its inner basins were a direct descendant of the Greek neosoikoi, updated in scale and technology, but identical in purpose. The Venetian galleys that dominated the medieval Mediterranean were slender, shallow-drafted vessels, whose wooden hulls were as vulnerable to the biological and physical threats described earlier as any ancient trireme, and the winter haul-out remained as essential to their preservation as it had been to the ships of Themistocles. The arsenal's ability to house, inspect and maintain the entire Venetian war fleet simultaneously was the organisational foundation of Venetian naval power, and that power was exercised not just through the quality of Venetian sailors and admirals, but through the institutional competence of the maintenance system that kept the fleet operational. Outside Venice, the development of medieval European naval infrastructure followed a more fragmented pattern. The Norman Kingdom of Sicily, which at its 12th century height controlled the central Mediterranean from its bases at Palermo and Messina, built substantial naval facilities that drew on both Byzantine and Arab technical traditions. The Crusader states of the Levant, which depended on sea power for their survival, developed harbour facilities at Acre, Tyre and other coastal cities that combined Western European shipbuilding traditions with Eastern Mediterranean maintenance knowledge in ways that are only beginning to be understood through archaeological investigation. The Hanseatic League, the confederation of northern European merchant cities that dominated Baltic and North Sea trade from the 13th to the 17th centuries, developed its own maintenance tradition that combined the Viking clinker-building heritage with innovations driven by the demands of the heavy cargo trade. Hanseatic ships were built for capacity rather than speed, and their maintenance requirements reflected the different stresses of heavy cargo carrying versus the light, fast warship or fishing vessel. The Hansa cities, Lübeck, Hamburg, Bremen, Danzig, built harbour facilities scaled to their commercial needs, and the winter maintenance season in these ports involved the same combination of technical work and social gathering that characterised the ancient world's approach to the same problem. The long tradition of seasonal hauling, 25 centuries of ships being dragged out of the water every autumn and put back in every spring, did not end abruptly. It faded, unevenly and gradually, as a series of technical innovations changed the cost-benefit calculation that had made the haul-out necessary. Understanding these innovations and how they changed maritime practice is not just a story about technology, it is a story about the way accumulated knowledge and the pressure of economic competition drive invention, and about the unexpected consequences that flow from solutions to long-standing problems. The first major change was the development of more effective anti-fouling technologies. The limitation of pitch, tar, and the various additive compounds used in the ancient and medieval world was that they degraded relatively quickly. A season in the water was enough to wash out much of their effectiveness, returning the hull to vulnerability. What the maritime world needed was a coating that remained effective for longer, reducing the frequency with which ships needed to be hauled out for anti-fouling purposes, even if not eliminating the haul-out entirely. The answer, developed gradually in the 16th and 17th centuries, was copper sheathing. The idea of sheathing a ship's hull in copper was not entirely new. We have seen that lead sheathing was used in the ancient world, but copper had specific properties that lead lacked. Copper ions, released slowly from the copper sheet by the action of salt water, are toxic to the marine organisms that foul hulls. Copper-sheathed hulls fouled very much more slowly than unprotected wood or lead-sheathed wood, because the organisms that attempted to colonize the surface were killed by the copper ions before they could establish themselves. The copper sheathing also provided a physical barrier against worm boring that was more effective than lead, because the mechanical hardness of copper was greater. The adoption of copper sheathing was a gradual process driven partly by the problem of electrolytic corrosion. Copper in contact with the iron fastenings of the hull created a galvanic cell that accelerated the corrosion of the iron, eventually causing the fastenings to fail. This problem was only fully solved in the 18th century, with the development of copper fastenings specifically designed for use with copper sheathing. Once the electrolysis problem was resolved, copper sheathing spread rapidly through European navies. The British Royal Navy adopted it for the entire fleet in the 1780s, and the effect on maintenance intervals was dramatic. With copper-sheathed hulls, ships could remain in the water for much longer periods without the progressive fouling and worm damage that had previously necessitated the annual haul-out. The sailing season could be extended. The maintenance interval could be stretched from 1 year to several years. For naval operations, this was transformative. A fleet that did not need to be hauled out every winter could be kept at sea continuously, maintaining blockades and conducting operations through conditions that would previously have required the fleet to return to harbour for maintenance. The parallel development that ultimately ended the wooden ship era, and with it the entire tradition of seasonal hauling, was the iron hull. The transition from wood to iron in ship construction, which began in earnest in the 1820s and was essentially complete by the 1870s for large commercial and naval vessels, removed at stroke the primary biological threats that had made the haul-out necessary. Iron did not provide food or habitat for shipworms. It did not absorb water in the way that wood did. It could corrode, and corrosion management became the dominant maintenance challenge for iron ships. But the rust that attacked iron hulls did so on a different timescale and in a different pattern from the worm rot and fouling that attacked wood, and the maintenance practices that addressed it were correspondingly different. The iron hull also made the dry dock rather than the slipway the standard maintenance facility, because iron ships were too heavy to be hauled up a ramp in the ancient manner. The steam-powered pumps that could empty a dry dock in hours made the flooding and draining method practical at scales that would have been impossible with the pumping technology of earlier eras. The Victorian dry dock, a massive stone or concrete basin sealed by a watertight gate, drained by powerful pumps, was the definitive maintenance facility of the industrial age, and it replaced the ancient slipway entirely in any port that aspired to handle modern vessels. But the transition was not instantaneous, and in many parts of the world it was not complete until the 20th century. Traditional wooden shipbuilding and the maintenance practices associated with it persisted long after iron and steel had become dominant in European navies. In the Indian Ocean, the dhow tradition continued in wood. In the Pacific, traditional outrigger canoe cultures maintained their own seasonal maintenance practices. In the Mediterranean itself, small wooden fishing boats were hauled out for winter maintenance well into the modern era, and in some places the practice continues today, in communities that build and maintain wooden vessels according to methods that would be recognizable to a Phoenician shipwright. The history of ancient ship maintenance would be largely theoretical, a reconstruction from written sources and logical inference, if it were not for a remarkable body of physical evidence: the preserved ships themselves. Wooden ships survive under specific conditions that are, in most marine environments, extremely rare. They need to be protected from the oxygen that enables the biological processes of decay, and they need to be in a stable environment that prevents the mechanical deterioration that would otherwise reduce them to splinters within a few centuries. The places where these conditions exist, the cold, low-oxygen waters of the Baltic Sea, the dry desert soils of Egypt, the anoxic muds of certain harbour basins, have preserved ships in states that allow us to read the details of their construction and maintenance in ways that no text can provide. The Vasa is perhaps the most famous of these preserved vessels. The Swedish warship that sank on her maiden voyage in a Stockholm harbour in 1628, recovered from the harbour mud in 1961, and now preserved in a purpose-built museum, is a time capsule of the shipbuilding and maintenance culture of the early 17th century. The extraordinary state of her preservation, she retained about 95% of her original timber, has allowed researchers to study her hull in detail that is simply impossible for ancient vessels. And what they found when they studied her maintenance tells a story that is both specific to the Vasa and universal to the wooden ship tradition. The Vasa showed evidence of hasty construction and compromised maintenance standards driven by the political pressure of a Swedish king who was at war and wanted his flagship ready before she was truly ready. The hull was asymmetrical, wider on one side than the other, in a way that suggests hurried construction with inadequate oversight. The gun ports that would eventually allow water to flood in and sink her were positioned too close to the waterline, a design compromise that her builders may have known was dangerous but were unable to resist the king's insistence on the number and placement of his guns. And the quality of the timber in parts of the hull was below the standard that experienced shipwrights would have accepted, suggesting that the normal process of careful timber selection and seasoning had been bypassed in the rush to launch. The Greek and Roman wrecks recovered from the Mediterranean, though far less complete than the Vasa, tell complementary stories about maintenance culture. The Antikythera wreck, the ship that carried the famous mechanism now named after it, as well as a cargo of bronze and marble sculpture discovered by sponge divers in 1900 near the Greek island of Antikythera, shows in what remains of its hull evidence of repairs that were made during its working life. Patches of new timber inserted into an older hull, caulking that is different in character at different locations, suggesting that it was applied at different times. The physical evidence of a ship that had been worked on, maintained and repaired over years of service before it met its end in a storm around 60 BC. The Uluburun wreck, discovered off the coast of southern Turkey in 1982 and dated to approximately 1300 BC, is the oldest substantially intact merchant ship yet found, and its cargo is one of the most extraordinary assemblages of late Bronze Age material ever recovered. Copper ingots, tin ingots, glass, ebony, ivory, gold and silver jewellery, Canaanite amphorae, Mycenaean pottery, Egyptian scarabs. The ship was carrying the trade goods of an entire interconnected world. What is particularly interesting about the Uluburun wreck from a maintenance perspective is the evidence in its cargo for the maintenance materials that were carried on long-distance voyages: stone anchors, spare rigging components, tools that could be used for running repairs. The ancient merchantman on a long voyage could not rely on finding everything it needed in every harbour it visited. It carried its own maintenance capacity with it. Perhaps the most moving evidence for ancient ship maintenance comes from the ship burials of Scandinavia, specifically from the Osberg ship mentioned earlier and the Gokstad ship, also in Oslo, which dates to around 890 AD. These ships were buried as funeral monuments for high-status individuals, and their preservation is due to the protective properties of the blue clay of the burial mounds. The Gokstad ship, when excavated in 1880, was found to contain not just the ship itself, but a range of objects associated with its maintenance: tools for working wood, tar-making equipment, spare rigging components. The dead were buried with what they would need, and what they would need, in the world the Norse imagined after death, included the ability to maintain their ship. The archaeological evidence from harbour excavations adds a different dimension to the picture. At the Piraeus, the foundations of the Neosoikoi have been recovered in excavations that reveal not just the size and layout of the ship sheds, but the deposits that accumulated inside them during their long period of use: wood shavings, tool fragments, organic material that represents the residue of centuries of maintenance work. At Caesarea Maritima, the Roman harbour built by Herod the Great, on the Palestinian coast in the late 1st century BC, the underwater archaeology has revealed the plan of the harbour in remarkable detail, including the locations of what appear to be maintenance facilities for the fleet that used the port. The history of ship maintenance is, among other things, a history of what happens when maintenance is neglected. The disasters produced by unmaintained ships are as instructive as the successes produced by well-maintained ones, and they recur with a regularity across different cultures and different centuries that speaks to something fundamental about the relationship between institutional discipline and catastrophe. We have already mentioned the Roman fleet disasters of the First Punic War. Those losses were primarily meteorological, storms that a more experienced maritime culture would have avoided by not sailing in dangerous conditions, but they were made catastrophically worse by inadequate hull maintenance. Ships that were structurally compromised by deferred maintenance were less able to survive the stresses of a major storm than ships that were in proper condition. Ancient sources hint that some of the ships lost at Camarina in 255 BC were already in poor condition before the storm hit, ships pushed back into service without adequate repair because the strategic situation seemed to demand it. The storm simply finished what deterioration had begun. The Persian fleet that faced Athens at Salamis in 480 BC is perhaps the most dramatic example of the maintenance gap as a strategic factor. The Persian navy was massive. Ancient sources give numbers that modern historians discount as exaggerated, but which were certainly far larger than the Greek fleet, and it was made up of contributions from multiple subject peoples, including Phoenicians, Egyptians, Ionians, and others who maintained their ships to varying standards. The Phoenician contingent, by all accounts, was the most effective. Its ships were well maintained, its crews were experienced, and its performance at the earlier Battle of Artemisium had been the best in the Persian fleet. But the Egyptian and Ionian contingents were more variable, and the overall maintenance standard of a fleet assembled from such diverse sources and rushed into service for a specific campaign was inevitably lower than that of a fleet like the Athenian, which had been built and maintained as a unified institutional project over years. The Battle of Salamis turned on many factors: strategy, geography, leadership, the divided, command of the Persian fleet, but the quality of the ships and their maintenance was one of them. Triremes that were poorly maintained were slower, less manoeuvrable, and more fragile in the chaos of a battle involving hundreds of ships in confined waters. A ramming attack that a sound trireme would have survived, taking damage but remaining afloat and battleworthy, could sink a hull compromised by worm or rot. The margins in ancient naval warfare were narrow, and maintenance was one of the things that determined which side of those margins you were on. The late Byzantine fleet's deterioration, described in the previous section, provides a medieval counterpart to these ancient examples. The documentary record of Byzantine naval disasters in the final centuries of the empire shows a clear correlation between maintenance failure and operational failure, ships that could not be deployed because they were unseaworthy, crews that could not be assembled because the ships they would have manned had been allowed to rot, harbour facilities that could not support the maintenance operations that would have reversed the deterioration. The circle was vicious and self-reinforcing. Reduced revenue meant reduced maintenance, which meant reduced fleet effectiveness, which meant reduced ability to enforce the maritime trade that generated revenue. The case of the Spanish Armada in 1588 is not strictly an ancient history example, but it is too instructive to omit. The Armada that Philip II of Spain sent against England was one of the largest naval forces assembled in the Age of Sail, and its failure was overdetermined. It faced bad weather, an effective English fleet, and strategic mismanagement that no amount of seamanship could have overcome. But among its many problems was a maintenance failure of exactly the kind that the ancient tradition of seasonal hauling was designed to prevent. The barrels of food and water stored in the holds of the Armada's supply ships had been made from unseasoned wood that had not been properly dried and aged before being shaped into staves, and they leaked, not catastrophically but continuously, contaminating the provisions with salt water and causing a progressive deterioration of the food supply that left the fleet increasingly unable to sustain its crews over the long voyage it attempted. The inadequate maintenance of the supply infrastructure was as damaging to the Armada as any cannonball. What these disasters have in common is the structure of the failure. A maintenance problem that was known or knowable was deferred because of the pressure of short-term circumstances, the urgency of a campaign, the constraint of a budget, the impatience of a ruler, and the deferral compounded until the accumulated deficit became a catastrophe. This is a failure mode so common across human institutions that it has a name in modern organizational theory: technical debt. The ancient maritime world understood it in its own terms, and the institutional systems it built, the ship catalogues, the triarchy, the naval boards, the neosoi koi, were fundamentally systems designed to prevent technical debt from accumulating to the point of catastrophe. The knowledge that maintenance could not be indefinitely deferred was hard won. It was written in wrecks and lost fleets and defeated campaigns across the full span of ancient and medieval history. Every culture that achieved real maritime power achieved it partly by finding ways to institutionalize the maintenance discipline that individual actors, left to their own devices, would always be tempted to defer. And every culture that lost maritime power did so partly because it lost the institutional discipline to maintain its fleet, because the accumulated knowledge of generations was allowed to dissipate, because the infrastructure was not renewed, because the men who knew how to read the sound of a mallet on a plank and tell from that sound whether the wood behind it was sound or rotten were no longer trained in sufficient numbers to sustain the tradition. The story of seasonal ship maintenance does not end with the triumph of iron hulls and Victorian dry docks. It continues, in diminishing circles, into the modern era, preserved in the practices of communities that maintained traditional wooden boat building and seamanship long after the Industrial Revolution had made those practices economically marginal. These communities, scattered along the coasts of Norway, the Adriatic, the Turkish Aegean, the Kerala coast of India, and the islands of the Pacific, were the last living links to a tradition of practical maritime knowledge that stretched back to the Bronze Age, and their gradual disappearance in the 20th century represents one of the quieter but most significant cultural losses of the modern era. In Norway, the tradition of the wooden boat and its seasonal maintenance persisted in the fishing communities of the western fjords well into the 20th century. The fishing boats of the Norwegian coast, the Offjordsbåt, the Nordlandsbåt, the Færing, were built in the clinker tradition that descended directly from the Viking shipbuilding of 1,000 years earlier, and they were maintained by the same basic seasonal cycle. Hauled out after the fishing season, dried and inspected in the boathouse through the winter, repaired with the same pine tar and oakum that their Viking ancestors had used, and launched again in spring with the same combination of practical calculation and semi-ritual attention that had accompanied every ship launch since people first put to sea. The boat builders of the Adriatic coast, the Venetian lagoon, the Dalmatian islands, the Gulf of Kotor, maintained wooden boat traditions rooted in the medieval and ancient Mediterranean heritage. The gondola of Venice is the most famous of these traditional vessels, but it represents only one branch of a richly diverse tradition of wooden boat construction and maintenance that is documented in the tools and techniques of craftsmen who learned their trade from fathers and grandfathers in an unbroken chain of transmission. The caulking techniques used by a Venetian boat builder in the early 20th century were directly descended from those used in the arsenal 5 centuries earlier, which were in turn descended from techniques developed in the ancient Mediterranean world. On the Turkish Aegean coast, the tradition of wooden gullet construction, the large wooden sailing and motor yachts that began as working cargo vessels and evolved into the luxury charter boats still built and sailed today, preserved practices from the Ottoman and Byzantine maritime traditions. The craftsmen of Bodrum and Marmaris who build gullets today use tools and techniques that would be immediately recognizable to medieval shipwrights and the seasonal maintenance practices of the traditional gullet. Fleet, hauling out in autumn, treating the hull with traditional preparations, relaunching in spring, represent a living continuity with the ancient world that is more than metaphorical. In Kerala, the tradition of wooden boat construction and the maintenance practices associated with it continued into the 21st century in the boat-building communities of Baipur and Kozhikode. The dhow-building tradition of the Malabar coast, which produced vessels for the Arabian Sea trade that were indistinguishable in construction technique from the dhows of 2,000 years ago, was sustained by families in which the knowledge of sewn construction, timber selection, and seasonal maintenance was transmitted from generation to generation with the same faithfulness that the Vikings transmitted their clinker-building knowledge in Norway. The craftsmen who knew how to select the right teak, how to prepare the coir lashing, how to treat the hull with the appropriate preparations. These were the holders of a knowledge that had sustained the Indian Ocean trade for millennia. What made these communities so important was not just the specific techniques they preserved, but the tacit knowledge embedded in those techniques, knowledge that could not be written down or transmitted through instruction manuals, but required the direct experience of watching and doing. The caulker who had spent 30 years driving oakum knew things about the sound and feel of the process that no description could convey. The shipwright who had built 20 boats knew things about the behaviour of specific timber cuts under specific stresses that emerge from experience, not from calculation. This tacit knowledge, accumulated over lifetimes and transmitted through apprenticeship, was the real content of the ancient tradition, and it was what was lost when the last practitioners died without successors. The loss was not complete, and efforts to recover and preserve what remained of traditional maritime knowledge began in several countries in the second half of the 20th century. The Norwegian Maritime Museum System developed programs to document and preserve traditional boat-building techniques before the last practitioners died. The Greek government supported efforts to reconstruct and sail a working trireme, the Olympias, built in the 1980s using ancient specifications and modern replicas of ancient construction techniques, which in the process of building and sailing taught a generation of researchers things about ancient ship handling and maintenance that no text had preserved. Similar projects in the United Kingdom, the United States, and several other countries brought together historians, naval architects, and traditional craftsmen to reconstruct vessels from the ancient and medieval traditions and learn from the process of reconstruction what the original builders had known. The Olympias project deserves special mention. The decision to actually build and sail a working replica of an Athenian trireme, taken in the 1980s by a group that included historian John Morrison, naval architect John Coates, and the Greek government, was motivated precisely by the recognition that certain questions about how ancient ships worked could only be answered by building and sailing one. The theoretical arguments about the speed, the manoeuvrability, and the sailing characteristics of the trireme had been going on for over a century. The Olympias resolved several of them definitively by providing empirical data that no amount of textual analysis could have generated. And in the process of building and sailing her, the team encountered the maintenance challenges directly. The swelling and working of the green timber, the seam problems, the structural stresses of actually rowing a trireme at speed. Theory became practice, and the ancient knowledge became briefly alive again.